The day Sallie Hawthorne buried her last hen was the day she decided the Arizona Territory had won. She stood at the edge of the hardpan yard, the shovel handle rough against her palms, and looked out at what remained of the life she had built with her own 2 hands over 3 relentless years. The garden was cracked and pale under the October sun of 1882. Every row she had coaxed and watered and prayed overturned to dust by the August drought that had swept through Yavapai County like a judgment. The fence posts leaned at sorrowful angles. The roof of the small adobe house had begun to separate at one corner, letting in the night wind that carried the smell of sage and cold stone. And now old Mabel, the last of her 4 laying hens, lay stiff in the dirt, taken in the night by something that had slipped beneath the wire. Sallie pressed the back of her wrist to her forehead and stared at the grave she had just dug. She was 26 years old and felt considerably older. Her hands were rough. Her dark brown hair, once her mother's pride, hung in a practical braid down her back because there was no one left to see it down. She had come to the territory from Missouri at 23 as the wife of Thomas Hawthorne, a man with large dreams and a weak constitution who had spent the final 6 months of his life coughing in a chair while Sallie planted and carried and bargained and mended, and who had left her the 160 acres, a mule named General, and a debt at the Prescott mercantile that made her stomach clench every time she counted what was left in the tin can above the fireplace. Thomas had been kind. She did not blame him. She blamed the land, the drought, the cattle tick that had killed the 2 cows she bought with what little was left after the funeral, the early freeze that had taken her peach seedlings, and she blamed, in her most honest and private moments, herself for believing that the territory was a place that could be shaped into a home. She pushed the dirt over the hen and stood straight. "That is enough," she said aloud. There was no one to hear her. General raised his long gray head from the water trough and looked at her with mild eyes. "I mean it," she told the mule. She had already written to her cousin Adelaide in Flagstaff, asking if there was room and perhaps some form of steady work. She had already begun making the quiet inventory of what could be sold and what would have to be left behind. She had already allowed herself to grieve the stubborn hope she had carried for 3 years, the belief that if she worked hard enough and wanted it badly enough, the territory would eventually yield. It had not yielded. It had simply ground her down. She went inside and poured herself a cup of water from the clay pitcher and sat at the table and looked at the 4 walls of the place she had tried to make her own. A piece of yellow calico over the window, a painted tin plate that had been her mother's, now hanging crooked on a nail. Thomas's good hat still on the hook by the door because she had never been able to make herself take it down. She was going to leave. She had made the decision. She was nearly peaceful about it. What she had not accounted for was the following morning, when she hitched General to the small wagon and drove the 14 miles into Prescott to pay what she could on the mercantile account and begin making arrangements, and everything changed because of a hat tip. The town of Prescott in the autumn of 1882 was a busy, bristling place, the territorial capital with its wooden storefronts and its courthouse square, its saloons running along Whiskey Row, its respectable citizens on one side of the street and its less respectable ones on the other, and everyone tangled together at the muddy intersections in between. Sallie drove the wagon in from the South Road and found the main street thick with activity. A cattle drive had come through the night before, and the drovers were spending freely, and the merchant boys were carrying crates, and the women from the seamstress shop were peering from their window, and the smell of horses and frying meat hung over everything. She tied General at the rail outside Halpern's mercantile and climbed down from the wagon, smoothing her gray dress, which was clean but worn thin at the elbows. She carried herself as she always had, straight-backed and direct, because her mother had told her that poverty was nothing to apologize for but carelessness was, and she had taken that to heart. She was crossing the boardwalk when 3 things happened in rapid succession. First, a boy of about 10 ran full tilt out of the alley beside the feed store and collided with her hip hard enough to spin her sideways. Second, the small paper parcel she was carrying, which contained the mercantile account ledger and her carefully counted coins, flew from her hands and burst open on the planking, sending coins rolling in every direction. Third, a man coming from the opposite direction stepped forward immediately, crouching to gather the rolling coins before they found the gaps between the boards. Sallie dropped to her knees too, reaching for what she could. The boy had already disappeared. She was calculating how many coins had made it through the boards and how much that would cost her when the man beside her straightened and extended his hand, palm open, with every coin that had been on his side of the scatter. She looked up. He was tall, somewhere in his early 30s, with a face that had been worked on by the sun and weather but remained open and composed. He wore a good brown hat, trail dusty but well-shaped, and a dark canvas coat over a plain shirt. His boots were working boots, not show boots. He had dark eyes and a jaw that carried a few days of growth, and he was looking at her not with pity or with the particular brand of patronizing helpfulness she had grown accustomed to from men who assumed a woman alone was also a woman confused, but with straightforward, attentive concern. "I believe these are yours," he said. His voice was low and even. She took the coins. "Thank you. Are you all right?" "Yes," she said, and then because she was honest almost to a fault, she amended it. "My parcel is ruined, but I am otherwise unharmed." He looked at the scattered paper and bent to collect the pieces without being asked. He handed those to her as well. And then, when she was standing again, he reached up and removed his hat in a slow, deliberate arc and held it against his chest and met her eyes. It was a small thing. Men tipped their hats to women in Prescott dozens of times a day. It was habit and reflex and social custom, and most of the time it meant nothing at all, a flicker of courtesy that evaporated the moment the hat settled back. Sallie had watched it happen 1,000 times and stopped noticing it long ago. But this man's hat came off slowly and stayed off while he looked at her directly, and when he brought it back to his head, there was something in the gesture that was entirely deliberate, a genuine acknowledgement, as though he saw her clearly and wanted her to know it. "Clarence Bancroft," he said. "I have a ranch about 8 miles east on the Verd Road." "Sallie Hawthorne," she said. "I have a homestead south of town." She paused, then added, because the decision was made and there was no harm in saying it plainly, for a little while longer at any rate. Something moved in his expression, careful and attentive. "Leaving? Making arrangements too," she said. He seemed to weigh something. "I am sorry to hear that. The territory does not make it easy." It was such a simple, direct statement, not an argument, not a lecture about perseverance, not the reflexive insistence that things would surely improve. It was simply an acknowledgement that the territory was hard and that she had likely found it so. Sallie felt something shift in her chest, small and unexpected, like a door that had been painted shut moving a fraction of an inch. "No," she agreed. "It does not." He nodded once and looked as though he might simply wish her well and go his way, and she thought that would be the end of it, a brief island of decency in an otherwise difficult morning. But instead he said, "Are you heading into Halpern's?" "I am. I have business there as well. If you would allow me, I would walk in with you. That boy who ran into you belongs to one of my drovers. I owe you an apology on his behalf." She considered declining on the grounds that she did not need an escort and had not needed one for years. She considered accepting because there was something in this man's manner that she found she did not want to walk away from quite yet. She considered both possibilities in the space of about 2 seconds and then said, "All right." He walked beside her without touching her, without attempting to take her arm as so many men would have, simply matching her pace and holding the door of the mercantile open when they reached it. Inside the cool dimness of the store, with its smell of dried tobacco and leather, and the sweet dustiness of grain sacks, Sallie went to speak with old Mr. Halpern about the account while Clarence Bancroft went to place his order at the far end of the counter. She conducted her business quietly and efficiently. She explained that she would be selling the homestead claim within the next few weeks and would settle the remainder of the account in full at that time. Mr. Halpern, who was a reasonable man, noted it in the ledger without commentary. When she turned to leave, Clarence Bancroft was waiting near the door, not impatient, not hovering, simply present. "If you have eaten this morning," he said, "do not let me keep you. But if you have not, the hotel dining room serves a decent noon meal, and I would be glad of the company if you are willing." Sallie had eaten a piece of cornbread at dawn and nothing since. She looked at him steadily. "I would not want you to feel obligated because of what happened outside." "I do not feel obligated," he said. "I feel inclined." He said it simply, without embellishment, the way a man states a fact. She studied him another moment. She was going to leave the territory. She had no intention of forming any attachment or complication. But a meal was a meal, and loneliness, she had discovered, was its own kind of hunger. "All right," she said. "Thank you." The hotel dining room smelled of roasted chicken and fresh bread and was only half full at this hour. A Navajo woman in a calico apron brought coffee and a bowl of biscuits without being asked, and Sallie wrapped both hands around the tin cup and felt something in her shoulders release. Clarence Bancroft ate the way he did everything. It seemed, with a certain deliberate ease, without hurry and without show. He asked about her homestead, and she told him honestly. The quarter section south of Granite Creek, the 2 cows she had lost, the garden she had fought for and mostly failed to keep, the hen she had buried yesterday morning. She did not soften it. She had learned that softening things just meant explaining them twice. He listened without interrupting, which was unusual enough that she noticed it. When she finished, he said, "How long have you been working it alone?" 17 months, she said. "My husband Thomas passed in May of last year." "I am sorry." "Thank you." She looked at her coffee. "He was a good man. He would have been the first to admit he was not built for this country." "I sometimes think neither of us was, but I was more stubborn about admitting it." "Stubbornness is not the worst quality in this part of the world," he said. "No," she agreed, "but it costs you." He was quiet a moment. Then he said, "My father came out here from Georgia in 1865. After the war, he had nothing. He built the ranch from raw land, just him and 2 hired men, and eventually my mother, who came out from Cincinnati by stage." He looked at the window, where the street outside was bright and busy. "She used to say the territory asked more than it gave for a long time, and then one year it started giving back. But she also said you had to still be standing when it turned." "Your parents are still there, at the ranch." Something passed over his face. "My father passed 4 years ago. My mother went back to Cincinnati to be near her sister. The ranch is mine now, 3,000 acres and a decent herd." He said it without boasting. It was simply information. "I run it with 2 permanent men and hire seasonal as needed." "It must have taken a great deal to get to 3,000 acres, she said. "It took my father's life and most of my 20s, he said plainly. "I will not pretend otherwise." She respected that. She found she was respecting quite a lot about this man in a short span of time, which was interesting, given that she had essentially concluded her business with the territory and everyone in it. "What will you do in Flagstaff?" he asked. "My cousin Adelaide has a laundry business. She says she can use another pair of hands." She paused. "It is not what I imagined when I came west, but it is honest work and I will not starve." "That is something," he said, and he said it without condescension, which she appreciated. They talked through the meal and then passed it, over a second cup of coffee that appeared without either of them asking. She learned that he was 32 years old, that he had been briefly engaged 7 years ago to a woman named Clara, who had ultimately chosen to return to Virginia rather than stay in the territory, and that he bore this history without apparent bitterness. He learned that Sallie had grown up in a river town, that she had taught reading to the younger children in the settlement school for 2 years before she married Thomas, and that her great private pleasure, the one she had almost entirely abandoned in the territory, was reading whatever she could borrow, buy, or find. "I have a box of books at the ranch," he said. "My father was a reader. I keep them, but I rarely open them, and I have always felt that was a waste." "It is a considerable waste," she said. He smiled at that, a real smile, slow and warm, and she found herself smiling back before she quite decided to. She drove back south that afternoon in the wagon with General plodding steadily ahead, and she thought about Clarence Bancroft with a careful, deliberate wariness. She was leaving. She had decided. The decision was sound, and she was not the kind of woman who remade sound decisions simply because she had shared a pleasant meal with an agreeable man. But the hat tip kept returning to her. Not the gesture itself, but the quality of it, the intention behind it. She had been seen. For the first time in a very long time, someone had simply looked at her and seen her. She arrived home in the late afternoon, unhitched General, filled his water bucket, and stood in the yard looking at the listing fence posts and the cracked garden ground. The house sat quiet and patient, as it always did, waiting to see what she would do next. That evening she sat at the table and wrote a letter to Adelaide saying she would be coming before the new year. She folded it, addressed it, and set it on the table. Then she sat for a long time looking at nothing in particular. Clarence Bancroft had not expected to think about Sallie Hawthorne after she drove her wagon south and disappeared around the bend in the road. He had gone about the rest of his afternoon business, picked up the grain and harness fittings he had ordered, had a word with the county land recorder about a water rights question on the eastern boundary of his property, and ridden the 8 miles home on his gray horse Palo as the sun went copper behind the mountains. But she was there in his mind with a persistent, quiet presence, the way a piece of music stays without your asking it to. He was not a romantic man by nature, or at least he had not thought of himself as one. He was a practical man who ran a working ranch and made practical decisions, and had largely concluded after Clara left that the territory and love did not coexist gracefully for men like him. He had that thought, held it, acknowledged it, and found that Sallie Hawthorne had somehow made it seem less certain. She had not asked him for a single thing. She had not performed helplessness or deference. She had eaten her meal and drunk her coffee and spoken plainly, and listened when he spoke and argued with him mildly, but firmly when she disagreed with something he said about the Colorado River Water Compact, which was not at all what he had expected. She had dignity that came from the inside rather than from circumstances, which was the only kind worth having. And she was leaving. He turned that over on the ride home, and by the time he reached the ranch gate, he had not resolved it so much as established that it mattered to him, which was more than he had expected. His foreman, a barrel-chested man named Pete Drummond who had been with the Bancroft operation since Clarence was 14, met him in the yard. Pete was somewhere around 50 and had been married twice, both times to formidable women, and had developed over the decades a reliable instinct for when something was on Clarence's mind. "Good trip to town?" He'd asked, taking Palo's reins. "Yes," Clarence said. Then, because Pete would figure it out eventually anyway, he said, "I met someone." Pete looked at him with the careful patience of a man who had learned not to react too quickly to this kind of statement. "That right. A widow. She has a homestead south of Granite Creek. She is planning to sell it and move to Flagstaff." Pete considered this. "And you are troubled by that?" "I am thinking about it," Clarence said. "That is not the same as troubled." "It might be," Clarence allowed. Pete handed Palo off to the younger hand, a 19-year-old named Hector Vega who was learning the work with genuine enthusiasm, and walked alongside Clarence toward the house. "Is she a good woman?" "I believe so," Clarence said. "She is honest, I know that much. She buried her last hen yesterday, and she told me so at dinner without apology or performance." Pete was quiet for a moment. "A woman who can tell the truth plainly about losing her last hen is worth knowing better," he said finally. "That is approximately what I think," Clarence said. 4 days after the Prescott visit, Sallie was sorting through the contents of the house, separating what would be sold from what would be shipped to Flagstaff, when she heard a horse on the road. She went to the window. A man on a gray horse was coming down the lane from the north. Clarence Bancroft. She watched him come, feeling a cascade of complicated things that she did not immediately try to name. He rode well, naturally, in the way of a man who had spent most of his life on horseback. He lifted a hand when he saw her in the window. She went to the door. "Mr. Bancroft," she said. "Mrs. Hawthorne." He dismounted and looped Paulo's reins over the fence post, and then he stood in the yard with his hat in his hands, which was different from the street in Prescott because there was no social requirement for it here. It was simply a choice. "I hope I am not intruding." "You are not," she said. "Would you like some water? I am afraid I have not much else to offer." "Water is fine," he said. She brought 2 cups of water and they stood in the yard, which was not the most comfortable arrangement, but was the only honest one, since the inside of the house was in the deliberate disarray of a woman in the process of dismantling her life. "I wanted to return this," he said, and produced from his coat pocket a small coin, a 3-cent piece that must have rolled under his boot on the mercantile boardwalk and been pocketed without his noticing. "I found it in my coat last night." She looked at the coin. 3 cents. He had ridden 8 miles to return 3 cents. They both knew that was not why he had come. "Thank you," she said, taking it. He held his cup and looked out at the land around them. "It is good land," he said thoughtfully. "The creek angle is favorable. The soil is decent when there is water," she agreed. "The problem is the water." "There is a spring on the eastern side of my property," he said, "that I have been meaning to run a small diversion ditch from. I have the water rights to it. I have simply not gotten to it." He paused. "Your eastern property line borders a section that borders my land. There is a way with some work to bring water to this ground." She looked at him directly. "Mr. Bancroft, I am not trying to convince you to stay," he said quickly, and there was something honest and earnest in it that she believed. "I am simply observing. What you do with the observation is entirely your affair." She looked at her hands, at the cracks in the earth at her feet, at the fence line with its leaning posts. "The bank debt on the claim is $72, she said. "I know what claims like this carry," he said, "and I have $12 in the tin can above the fireplace." He was quiet. "I am not asking you for money," she said clearly. "I want you to understand I am not that kind of woman." "I know you are not," he said, and she believed that too. "I am simply telling you the arithmetic," she said, "because the arithmetic is why I am going to Flagstaff." He turned his hat in his hands. "What if the arithmetic could be changed?" She waited. "I need someone to keep the books for the ranch," he said carefully. "My father kept them himself, and I have been doing it since he passed, and I am honestly not very good at it. Pete Drummond, my foreman, is worse. I have been thinking about hiring someone with education and sense." He looked at her steadily. "You said you taught a reading school. I imagine you can keep a ledger." "I can keep a ledger," she said slowly. "I would pay a wage," he said. "A fair one. Enough to service that bank debt over a few months if the numbers go as I expect this season." She looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved the dry grass at the fence line. A hawk turned high overhead in a slow, patient circle. "You are offering me a job," she said. "I am offering you a job," he confirmed. "Nothing more than that. The arrangement is entirely a business one. You would come to the ranch 3 days a week to work the books. The rest of the time the claim is yours. And the spring ditch. I will have Pete and Hector start it next week regardless," he said. "That is a ranch improvement that makes sense independent of you or your situation. I should have done it 2 years ago." She did not believe for a single moment that he had woken up last night with a sudden inspiration about water diversion ditches. But the thing was, he was not asking her to believe it. He was constructing her a plausible arrangement with her dignity intact, and he was doing it carefully and without pressure, and she found that she respected it enormously. "I would want to see the ledgers before I agree," she said, "to know the scope of the work." "Of course," he said, "and I would want the wage agreed in writing." "Naturally," he said. She looked at the house, then she looked at him. "I have not said yes." "No," he agreed, "you have not. But I have not said no." "No," he agreed again. "You have not." A bird called somewhere in the brush. General wandered to the far side of his small pen. The sun moved a degree or two in its long arc. "Thursday," she said. "I will come Thursday to look at the books." Something lit in his dark eyes, brief and genuine. "Thursday is fine," he said. She came on Thursday. She drove the wagon out the Verd Road in the early morning, the air cold and bright and smelling of juniper, and found the Bancroft ranch sitting in a good wide valley with the creek running along its southern edge and the mountains rising blue and enormous to the east. The main house was a solid adobe and timber building, large but not pretentious, with a covered porch along the front and several outbuildings in reasonable repair. She could see cattle dotting the hillside to the north, a healthy herd, and there were horses in the western corral that looked well kept and sound. Pete Drummond met her in the yard, a broad, weathered man with a gray mustache and eyes that evaluated everything quickly and made no show of it. He helped her down from the wagon with professional courtesy and informed her that Mr. Bancroft was in the back pasture but would be up before noon, and in the meantime the ledgers were on the table in the front room as requested. She spent 3 hours with the ledgers. They were in the condition she had half expected, not fraudulent or corrupt, simply disorganized, maintained with the harried imprecision of a man keeping numbers as a secondary duty while his primary attention was the land and the cattle. There were figures recorded in 3 different hands over the years, the father's careful script giving way to a looser style that she identified as Clarence's, and then a cramped, hesitant hand that must have been Pete's during whatever period Clarence had delegated the task. The core information was all there. It simply needed reorganizing, cross-referencing, and bringing into a consistent system. She was making notes in her own hand when Clarence came in, dusty and warm from the morning's work, and stopped in the doorway of the front room. "You are frowning," he said. "I am concentrating," she corrected. He went to wash up and came back and stood looking over her shoulder at the notes she had made. He smelled of horses and leather and the clean outdoor cold. "Is it salvageable?" "It is entirely salvageable," she said. "You are not missing any significant figures. You are simply missing the architecture to make them useful." She looked up at him. He was quite close, closer than she had expected, and she felt the proximity as a kind of warmth. "I can build you a proper system. Debentry ledger, monthly reconciliation, a separate column for capital improvements versus operating costs. Within 4 months you will be able to look at a single page and know exactly where you stand." He was looking at her in a way that was about more than ledgers, and they both knew it, and she held his gaze without looking away. "What would you need to begin?" he said. 3 good ledger books, a decent pen, and your honest answers to my questions," she said, no matter how awkward the question. "I can give you all 3, he said. "Then we have a deal," she said, and extended her hand the way a man would. He took it and shook it firmly, and neither of them let go quite at the pace of a purely business transaction. The weeks that followed were the most complicated and interesting weeks Sallie had experienced in some years. She came to the ranch on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. She set up the new ledger system with methodical care, working through the accumulated accounts with the particular satisfaction of bringing order to chaos. Clarence answered her questions honestly, sometimes with obvious discomfort when she unearthed a record of a deal that had gone badly or a debt that had been carried too long, but always honestly. And they talked. They talked in the front room where she worked, when he came in from the morning's duties and poured coffee and leaned against the doorframe. They talked at the table during the noon meal that Pete's part-time cook, an older woman named Mrs. Ruiz, who drove out from Prescott 2 days a week, set on the table. They talked walking the fence lines when Sallie had a question about a capital improvement record, and Clarence took her out to see the relevant work so she could categorize it accurately. She met Hector Vega, the young ranch hand, who was quiet and hardworking, and who informed her gravely one afternoon that the books had been a disaster, and that Mr. Bancroft was relieved to have her help, which was more than Clarence had said directly. She learned that Pete Drummond had been widowed the previous spring, that his wife Rosa had been a woman of great warmth and considerable cooking ability, and that the entire ranch still felt her absence. She learned that the Bancroft cattle were mostly Herefords, that Clarence had been one of the early ranchers in the county to shift from Longhorns, and that the county land agent had considered him foolish for it until the Herefords proved out. She also found, quite without planning it, that the ranch had begun to feel like something. Not hers, not yet, not anything she had permission to call a feeling with any confidence, but something. The way the light came across the valley in the late afternoon, the sound of the cattle and the horses and the everyday industry of a working place, the particular quality of the silence in the front room in the morning, with the fire going and the ledger open and good coffee on the table, and the knowledge that she was doing work that mattered and being paid fairly for it. And then there was Clarence himself. She had begun to understand that the man she had met on the boardwalk in Prescott was not a performed version of himself, but the actual one. He was direct because directness was his natural state. He was patient because he had learned that impatience on a ranch was expensive, and he had generalized the lesson to the rest of life. He had a dry, quiet humor that surfaced unexpectedly and delighted her because it always arrived without announcement. He worked harder than anyone else on the property, including the hands he paid to work hard, and he never appeared to consider this noteworthy. He had also, since that first Thursday, maintained the business arrangement with scrupulous propriety. He did not crowd her. He did not make implications. He treated her with the respect owed a competent professional, which was, she had realized, exactly what she needed, and also, in some inexplicable way, an increasing frustration. It was Pete who said what neither of them would say, on a cold November morning when Sallie arrived to find him in the yard mending a length of fence and Clarence somewhere out beyond the eastern ridge. "You are not going to Flagstaff," Pete said. It was not a question. She stopped. The arrangement was temporary. Pete looked at her with those quick, evaluating eyes. "Is it?" She thought about the letter she had sent Adelaide explaining that she had found work that would cover the bank debt and that she would reassess before Christmas. She thought about Adelaide's practical, affectionate reply saying she understood and that the offer stood whenever Sallie wanted it. She thought about how she had stopped referring to the claim as something she was going to sell and had started referring to it as home, quietly, inside her own head, without quite deciding to. "I do not know," she said honestly. Pete turned back to the fence. "He is a good man," he said. "The best kind, which is the kind that does not know he is good. He just does what he does." "Mr. Drummond," she said carefully, "I appreciate your confidence in my judgment, but this is a business arrangement." Pete tied a wire knot with the sureness of long practice. "Sure it is," he said, and said nothing more, which was somehow worse than if he had argued. Sallie rode back to her claim that afternoon and stood in the yard as she often did now and looked at the place with new eyes. In the 6 weeks since she had taken the bookkeeping position, several things had changed. The water from the spring ditch that Clarence's men had built was now running through a small channel that Pete had helped her redirect to the garden bed. The soil was already responding. She had replanted a section of it with winter rye for ground cover, and the green shoots were pushing through the pale earth with admirable determination. She had also mended 3 of the fence posts, bought a new hen from Mrs. Ruiz's cousin, paid $50 against the bank debt, and rehung the yellow calico at the window more squarely than it had been before. She had not told anyone, certainly not Clarence, but she had also taken down Thomas's hat from the hook by the door. She had folded it carefully in the flour sack where she kept her few important papers, and she had stood for a moment in the absence of it and said a quiet goodbye, not to Thomas. She had said that goodbye long ago, but to the version of herself that had been waiting for something to change before she allowed herself to live. She went inside and lit the lamp and got out her own small ledger, the one she kept for her own affairs. She ran the numbers again, methodically, the way she had been trained by weeks of doing it for the ranch. She could keep the claim solvent through the winter. She could pay off the full bank debt by spring if the bookkeeping arrangement continued. She could buy 2 more hens, repair the roof corner, and still have a modest reserve. She could stay. The territory had not become easy. It had not become generous. But it had become possible in a way it had not been 6 weeks ago, and the difference, she admitted to herself in the lamplit quiet, was Clarence Bancroft. She sat with that admission for a while, turning it over with the same care she brought to the ranch ledgers. She looked at it from multiple directions. She examined the arithmetic and the emotion, and the practical consequence. And then she closed the ledger and folded her hands on the table and said to the empty room, "Sallie Hawthorne, you are half in love with a rancher who has not said a single word out of place, and you are going to have to decide what to do about that." The room offered no advice. Outside, the November wind moved through the sage. It was the bookshelf that broke the careful, professional distance between them. On a Saturday in mid-November, she arrived at the ranch to find a wooden crate sitting on the porch. Inside it, wrapped in newspaper, were 11 books. She was lifting one carefully when Clarence came around the side of the house, saw her, and stopped. "I said I had books," he said. "I thought perhaps you would like to borrow some." She unwrapped the newspaper from the one she was holding. It was George Eliot's Middlemarch, the first edition American printing, dog-eared and well-loved. She looked up at him and she could not entirely control what was in her face. "Where did you get this?" she said. "My mother left a box when she went back to Cincinnati," he said. "She is a great reader." She said when she came back for the ranch's good books, that particular one she wanted to give away first. Sallie looked at the book in her hands. She had read it once in Missouri before she came west and had thought about it often in the 3 years since, in the particular way you think about a book that told you something true. "I have not had something like this to read in over 2 years, she said. "You can keep it," he said. "All of them if you want." She looked at the box. She looked at him. "You cannot give me 11 books. "Why not?" She could not come up with a genuinely good reason. "It is too much." "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said gently, "I have had 11 books sitting in a crate for 4 years being read by no one. The books would prefer otherwise. You would prefer otherwise. I cannot understand where the problem is." She laughed. Not a polite, managed laugh, but a real one, sudden and warm, and she saw his face change at the sound of it, something opening in his expression that he did not quite control. "You are very reasonable," she said when she recovered. "I try to be," he said. "It is occasionally maddening," she said. Something shifted in his face again, something warmer and more intent. "Is it?" he said, less a question than a careful observation. They stood on the porch with the book between them and the cold mountain air around them, and the space that had been maintained with such mutual discipline over 6 weeks suddenly felt different, thinner somehow, as though it had been worn down from both sides simultaneously. "I have been thinking," he said carefully, "about whether there is something I ought to say." "I have been thinking the same thing," she said. He took a breath and looked out at the valley for a moment, and she could see him organizing his words the way he organized everything, deliberately. "I did not bring you on to keep the books because I had some idea of pretending to need books kept," he said. "The books needed keeping. I was honest about that. But I also will not pretend that finding a reason to see you again was not part of it." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "You know," he repeated. "I am a bookkeeper," she said. "I noticed the numbers, Mr. Bancroft. Your ledger situation was genuinely disordered, but it was not so bad that you could not have engaged a man from Prescott to sort it in a fortnight. You kept it disorderly for months because the right solution had not presented itself." He was quiet for a moment. "And are you angry about it?" She considered the question with honesty. "No," she said, "I am not, because you gave me the choice. You put the work in front of me and let me decide. You did not arrange my life without my knowledge. You built me a door and let me choose whether to walk through it." She paused. "I am grateful for that. I need you to understand that. I need to be the one who decides." "I know," he said quietly. "I have known that since the boardwalk." The wind moved across the porch. The cattle were distant and peaceful on the hillside. Somewhere in one of the outbuildings, Pete was doing something that involved a rhythmic hammering, which felt appropriate, like the heartbeat of an ordinary day continuing around an extraordinary moment. "I am not going to Flagstaff," she said. Something in him settled the way ground settles after rain. "I am glad to hear that. I am staying on the claim, The water channel your men built has already improved the ground considerably. Yes, he said, Pete told me. I want to plant properly in the spring, she said, and repair the roof corner before the worst of winter. I can send Hector to look at the roof corner, he said. I can pay for his time, she said. You can pay for his time, he agreed. She looked at the book in her hands. And I would like to keep this, she said, the Elliot. I hoped you would, he said. They stood another moment in the cool air, and she felt the territory around her differently than she had in 3 years, not as an adversary she was losing to, but as a place, complicated and demanding and capable of astonishing beauty in which she had chosen to make a life. Mr. Bancroft, she said. Clarence, he said, please. She looked at him steadily. Clarence. Sallie, he said, and the way he said it was careful and warm and meant exactly what it sounded like. Winter came to Yavapai County in earnest in December, and it was not the worst winter the territory had seen, but it was a firm one, with hard frosts and occasional snow that lay on the ground for days before the sun found it. Sallie kept her arrangement at the ranch through the cold months, driving the wagon in the mornings bundled in the heavy wool coat that had been Thomas's, and that she had altered to fit her smaller frame. The road was sometimes difficult. She never missed a day she had agreed to come. The ledger system was running smoothly by December. She had introduced a forward projection column so Clarence could see where his expenses would likely land in the coming season based on current patterns, and he had studied it for a long time the first time she showed him, and then looked at her with open appreciation that made warmth climb her neck. Where did you learn this? He asked. I taught myself from a banking manual I found in the lending library in Prescott, she said. And from paying attention to how things actually behave as opposed to how one wishes they would. That is better than formal training, he said. It is different, she said. Whether it is better depends on what you need. He was studying the projection. If this holds, I can afford to expand the east pasture fence next fall and add another breeding bull. Within a 10% margin of uncertainty, she qualified. He looked up and smiled. You are the first person who has ever qualified good news with a 10% margin of uncertainty. Someone should, she said. He laughed, and she felt it the same way she always felt it, like something warm and real moving through the room. By Christmas, they had moved past the careful, formal address to something more natural, without either of them marking the exact moment of transition. She ate the noon meal at the ranch when she was there, and sometimes she stayed past her bookkeeping hours to help Mrs. Ruiz with a particularly large batch of preserving, or to sit on the porch with a borrowed book while Clarence finished his evening rounds. And then they would talk in the late afternoon cold until the light was gone, and she needed to start back before dark. He came to her claim sometimes. Not often and always with a stated purpose, to help with the roof corner repair, which Hector came to execute but which Clarence supervised, to bring a second hen that one of his laying hens had recently produced in an excess of agricultural enthusiasm, to deliver a parcel of seeds from the Prescott catalog that she had mentioned wanting. He never stayed long. He was always proper. But he also, every single time when he was leaving, would turn at the fence and tip his hat to her in exactly the way he had on the boardwalk in Prescott, slow and deliberate and entirely meant. She began to look forward to it in a way that she recognized was a problem and also was not. On Christmas Eve, he appeared at the claim door with a small package and a look of focused, slightly uncertain composure that was different from his usual ease. She invited him in. She had decorated the house modestly for the holiday, a cedar branch on the mantel and a length of red ribbon she had found in her sewing basket, and she had made a molasses cake that morning from a recipe Mrs. Ruiz had written out for her. I brought this, he said, handing her the package. It is not much. She opened it at the table. Inside was a small bottle of good ink and a pen nib in a fitted brass handle. She looked at it for a long moment. The pen you have been using all autumn is wearing thin, he said. You mentioned it last week. I happened to be in the stationer's before I noticed I was buying something. She turned the pen over in her hand. It was a good quality piece, the kind she would not have bought herself. "Thank you," she said quietly. "It is practical," he said, as though this needed establishing. "It is," she agreed and looked at him, and there it was between them, everything that had been building since October, obvious and tender and patient. She cut him a piece of the molasses cake. He stayed until the early dark was settling in. Before he left, she gave him the only thing she had thought to give anyone for Christmas, which was a 2-page summary she had prepared, not asked for, not part of the bookkeeping arrangement, of what the ranch's financial position had been when she took on the books versus where it stood now, with notes on what the trajectory suggested for the coming year. She had drawn it up cleanly and put it in a folded envelope. He opened it at the door and read it by the lamp light, and she watched his face move through the information. "Sally," he said when he reached the bottom. "The ranch is in a very sound position," she said. "You have worked for that. I thought you should see it clearly." He folded the paper and put it in his coat pocket, and he looked at her with something in his eyes that was full and serious. "I want to court you," he said, "properly if you are willing. I have wanted to say so for some time, and I am aware this is Christmas Eve and perhaps the timing is inelegant." She held his gaze. "The timing is fine," she said. "You said you need to be the one who decides," he said. "I am asking you. I am not arranging or constructing. I am asking you directly whether you would allow me to court you." She thought of the hat tip on the boardwalk, the 3-cent coin, the box of books, the water ditch, the pen in its brass handle. She thought of the slow, careful way he had built her a series of doors and waited at each one without pushing. "Yes," she said, "I would allow that." He smiled, that slow, warm smile, and he reached out and very briefly pressed her hand in both of his. And then he put his hat on and went out into the cold Christmas Eve, and she stood in the doorway and watched him go down the lane and felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for a very long time. January in the territory was a study in endurance, and Sally conducted it with the new assurance of a woman who has decided on her life rather than simply inhabiting it. She went to the ranch. She kept the books. She and Clarence went on what she privately called their courtship, which in the practical arithmetic of a rancher's life meant they drove together into Prescott on a Saturday when the weather allowed, and he escorted her to the small hotel dining room where they had first eaten, and they talked for 2 hours over a good meal about every subject under the Arizona sky. They talked about the Southern Pacific Railroad that was changing everything, bringing goods and people and new ideas. They talked about the question of the Apache reservation and the ongoing injustice of how the Yavapai people had been removed from their own land, forced from the Verde Valley years before, a removal that Sally found indefensible and said so plainly, and Clarence agreed, though he noted he had not had the courage to say so as plainly before hearing her say it. They talked about George Eliot and whether Dorothea Brooke should have made a different choice at the end of the novel. They disagreed about this extensively and with considerable pleasure. They attended a church social in late January, which was the county's version of a formal social occasion, and Sally wore her best dress, a deep blue wool that had not been out of the trunk since Thomas's funeral, and she felt herself inside it differently than she had then, present and forward-looking rather than hollow and adrift. Clarence arrived at her claim to collect her in the wagon, because the temperature had been dropping since noon and the trail would be cold, and when she came out of the house in the blue dress with her dark hair up, he looked at her the way she had begun to look forward to being looked at, directly, and with all the things he meant visible in his face. "You look beautiful," he said, and it was not a performance. It was an observation offered in the same plain, honest voice he used for everything. "Thank you," she said, and took his offered hand up into the wagon. At the social, they sat together and danced once, in the careful way of people who are not yet settled about each other but are clearly working toward it, and she felt the warmth of his hand at her waist and the steadiness of it, and she thought that steadiness was perhaps the thing she loved most, a word she had not quite used yet, even in the privacy of her own mind, though she was very close. February brought a late cold snap that froze the creek and kept most everyone indoors. But it broke in 10 days, and March arrived with an almost apologetic warmth. The hills going green overnight. The sky an unreasonable blue that made you feel the territory had been hiding its best qualities on purpose. She was in the garden one warm March morning, turning the soil that the winter rye had improved considerably, when Clarence rode down the lane and dismounted and stood at the fence watching her for a moment before she straightened and saw him. "The roses came out on the south wall of the ranch house," he said. "My mother planted them 6 years ago. They come back every spring. I thought you might like to see them." She looked at him. "And I thought perhaps, if you are not occupied this afternoon, we might take a walk along the creek pasture," he said. "I have been wanting to show you the spring where the diversion ditch begins." "The ledgers are current," she said. "I have the afternoon." She washed her hands and changed into a clean dress, and they walked together, which was something they had not done before, simply walked for the pleasure of it with no stated task or purpose. The green hills opened around them. The creek ran clear and cold along the flat below. The spring Clarence showed her was a beautiful thing, welling up from under a shelf of pale rock and running into a small pool where some early wildflowers had found the moisture and were already blooming, yellow and small and determined. "This is what is keeping your garden alive," he said. "I know," she said. "I am grateful for it every morning." They sat on the rock shelf beside the spring in the warm March sun, and she had her face tilted up and her eyes almost closed when he said, "Sallie." She opened her eyes and looked at him. He was watching her with the serious, focused expression he had worn on Christmas Eve, and she felt her heart move the way it had been moving with increasing regularity. "I have been thinking about this for some time," he said. "I have been thinking about it in the way I think about important decisions, which is slowly and from all angles, and I have come to the same conclusion from every angle." "What conclusion?" she said, though she thought she knew. "I love you," he said. "I want you to know that before I ask you anything else, because I want you to understand that everything else is secondary to that. The practical circumstances, the arrangements, all of that is secondary to the fact that I love you, and that this is the most certain I have been about anything in my life." She looked at him in the spring sunlight, at his honest, weathered face and his careful eyes, and the hat he was slowly removing from his head with the deliberate, genuine intention she had first noticed on a boardwalk in October. "I love you," she said. "I have known it for some time, and I was deciding when to say it." "And you have decided. You went first," she said. "I would have been insufferably strategic about it otherwise." He laughed and she laughed, and the spring ran cheerfully beside them in the warm afternoon. "Will you marry me?" he said. "I do not have a ring to offer you at this moment because I wanted to know the answer before I made any such purchase, which I realize is somewhat backwards." "It is very practical," she said. "It is very practical," he agreed. "Will you?" She looked at the spring and the yellow flowers and the hills going green in the season's warmth, and she thought about how this territory had taken from her and given her nothing back for 3 long years, and how in the space of 5 months it had given her a water channel and 11 books and a brass-handled pen, and this man, sitting on a rock in the sunshine, asking her to marry him. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He reached over and took her hand and held it, and they sat that way in the warm afternoon, with the spring running and the hills around them and the enormous, improbable sky above. And Sallie Hawthorne understood for the first time since coming west that the territory had not been kind to her. And then suddenly, entirely accidentally, it had, and that these two things were both true, and that the second did not erase the first but simply made it bearable. They were married in May. It was a Saturday wedding, because Saturday was when the most people could come from town, and they were married at the small stone church in Prescott by a minister named Reverend Adler, who was a serious man, but not a gloomy one, and who performed the ceremony with appropriate gravity and a detectable undercurrent of warmth. The church was not large, but it was full. Pete Drummond stood up with Clarence in the capacity of best man, and wore a suit that suggested considerable investment in the occasion. Mrs. Ruiz had organized the wedding supper single-handedly and had declined all offers of assistance except from Hector Vega's mother, who arrived from town with a covered dish of tamales that became the immediate favorite of every person at the celebration. Adelaide had made the journey from Flagstaff, arriving 2 days before the wedding and pronouncing Clarence acceptable within the first afternoon, which was high praise from Adelaide. Sallie wore a dress of pale ivory lawn cotton that she and Adelaide had made together in the week before the wedding, working in the evenings at the claim by lamplight, talking and sewing and laughing at nothing in particular the way sisters and cousins do when they are happy and know it. She stood at the church door before the ceremony began and looked at the May morning, the sky enormous and bright blue, and the mountains at the horizon still holding a little snow on their highest points, and she thought about all the mornings she had stood in a doorway looking out and felt only the weight of what was ahead. This morning the weight was still there because life did not stop being weighted when you loved someone, but it sat differently, distributed, shared. Adelaide stood beside her. "Are you ready?" "I have been ready since October," Sallie said. "I was simply taking my time." "That is the most Sallie Hawthorne thing I have ever heard," Adelaide said. She walked down the aisle of the small stone church on her own, because there was no male relation to escort her, and she had chosen not to ask for one, because she had walked through this territory on her own for 3 years, and she would walk this aisle the same way. She saw Clarence at the front of the church, standing straight with Pete beside him, and when he saw her he removed his hat and held it against his chest in exactly the way she had first seen him do it, and in front of the entire congregation, and it meant exactly what it had always meant, every time. She was still smiling when she reached him. The minister said the words. They said the words back. When Reverend Adler pronounced them married and Clarence put the slim gold ring on her finger and looked at her with everything he felt entirely visible in his face, she had no impulse whatsoever to look away from it. He kissed her in the careful way of a man in a church, and then more honestly when the congregation erupted in the cheerful noise of a community that is genuinely glad for two of its own. The summer of their first year of marriage was a working summer, as all summers on a ranch must be, but it was a good one. Sallie moved to the ranch in June, and the claim south of Granite Creek was leased to a young family, newly arrived from New Mexico, who wrote to her every month about how the water channel was performing beautifully, and how the soil was as good as she had promised. She continued keeping the books, because the books needed keeping and she was the best person to do it and they both knew it. But now, the keeping of them took place in the front room of the ranch house, which she had rearranged slightly to accommodate a writing desk of her own that Clarence had commissioned from the joiner in Prescott, and which arrived in August to a degree of satisfaction on her part that she tried not to make excessive. She put Middlemark on the shelf above the desk. She put the rest of the books there too, in order, and the shelf was full and looked exactly as a shelf of books in a home should look. She learned the ranch in the way she had learned everything in her life, by paying close attention over time. She learned the names and dispositions of each of the cattle, insofar as cattle have dispositions, and the horses thoroughly. She learned that Paulo, Clarence's gray horse, was deeply suspicious of anything orange in color, which Pete had never mentioned to anyone, and which had apparently caused a memorable incident involving a harvest pumpkin 2 autumns ago. She learned that Hector Vega was not just hardworking but genuinely gifted with horses, and that Clarence was quietly looking for a way to give him more responsibility and more pay, which she encouraged without reservation. She learned that her husband made coffee before dawn every morning and sat on the porch with it and looked at the valley coming out of the dark, and that he was perfectly content to have her there in silence beside him, and that she was perfectly content to be there. The first October of their marriage, he came in from the afternoon round and found her in the garden, which she had planted in the spring behind the ranch house in a patch of ground that had been fallow for years. It was a good garden, the best she had ever grown, partly because of the soil and partly because of the water, and partly because, for the first time, she was growing things not in desperation, but in celebration. She had a basket of late squash over her arm and was cutting the last of the autumn rosemary when he came through the gate and stopped and looked at her in the October sun, and then came over and wrapped his arms around her from behind, garden basket and all, and pressed his face against her hair. "What is that about?" she said. "Nothing particular," he said. "Everything general." She leaned back against him and looked out at the valley, at the mountains with their first seasonal snow and the cattle on the slope and the creek running in the distance. And she thought again what she had thought on the rock beside the spring in March, that the territory had failed her and then surprised her, and that she was grateful for both, because the failure had taught her who she was, and the surprise had given her what she needed. The following spring she told him she was expecting, on a morning in April when the valley was impossibly green, and she had been certain for 2 weeks but had been turning the fact over and finding the right moment, which turned out to be the pre-dawn porch with the coffee and the dark valley coming into light. She simply said, "I have something to tell you." He looked at her. She told him. He put down his coffee cup very deliberately and turned to her fully and looked at her for a long moment, and then took both her hands in his with a gentleness that was his most characteristic quality and said, "Are you well? Are you feeling all right?" It was so precisely the right response, so entirely him, that she felt the back of her eyes sting. "I am perfectly well," she said, "slightly queasy in the morning but otherwise entirely well." "Good," he said. "Good." He pressed her hands. "Good. You said that 3 times," she said. "I may say it a few more times," he said. She laughed and leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat in the April pre-dawn and watched the light come into the valley, and he kept hold of her hands. He told Pete that morning, and Pete's face went through a complete sequence of emotions before settling on gruff delight, and he shook Clarence's hand so firmly that Clarence reported his fingers aching afterward. Mrs. Ruiz, when informed, produced from somewhere a specific tea that she insisted was helpful for morning sickness, and arrived with it the following day, along with a detailed list of instructions for the next 8 months that Sallie received with sincere gratitude. Hector, who was 21 that spring and had been made second foreman in February to everyone's satisfaction, offered Sallie a small gift 2 days later, a wooden carving of a horse that he had made himself in the evenings, worn smooth and charming. She put it on the mantel. The months of the pregnancy were full and warm, and Sallie continued the books because sitting at a desk was not heavy work, and she rode out to the spring on horseback until July, when Clarence asked with great politeness whether she might consider more sedentary activities for the remainder, and she agreed because the request was reasonably made, not because she had any particular intention of becoming sedentary. She wrote to Adelaide at each milestone, and Adelaide's letters back were warm and detailed and full of opinions, and Sallie kept them all in the flour sack with the other papers she considered important. The child was born in November, a boy, and they named him Robert, for Clarence's father, with the middle name Thomas, because Sallie asked to honor the man who had brought her west, and she thought Clarence would understand, and he understood immediately and completely, and said he was glad to give the name. Robert Bancroft was a loud and opinionated infant from the first hour, which Sallie found entirely satisfying. He had Clarence's dark eyes and Sallie's stubborn chin, and Pete Drummond held him in the crook of his enormous arm on the 3rd day and looked down at him with an expression of such open tenderness that Sallie had to look away to recover herself. Clarence held his son in the evenings and sat in the chair by the fire, and Sallie watched him from the writing desk where she was catching up on a week's worth of neglected accounts, and she thought she had never in her life seen a man look so entirely at home. The years that followed were the years of a real life, which meant they contained both abundance and difficulty, and Sallie met both without the old sense that the territory was working against her specifically. She was working with the territory now, which was different, and she had a partner beside her. The winter when Robert was 18 months old was a hard one, the hardest since Sallie had first come to the territory, with cold that froze the water lines and a sustained period of weather that kept even the cattle indoors. And Clarence and Pete and Hector worked around the clock through the worst of it. And Sallie kept the house and the boy and the books, and had a supper on the stove every time they came in. There were losses that winter, 12 head of cattle to the cold, and a horse they had been particularly fond of. And the losses were mourned and then counted in the books and accounted for, and the work continued. On the far side of the hard winter, spring arrived in the way of springs in the territory, sudden and extravagant, and the herd had recovered better than the numbers had suggested they might. And Clarence sat at the table on a March evening and looked at the books Sallie set before him and shook his head slowly. "How did you know it would come out ahead?" he asked. "I did not know," she said. "I estimated based on the pattern of the previous 3 seasons and the historical cattle mortality rates for the region and the way the grays had been holding before the cold hit." She sat across from him. "There is no certainty. There is only the best information you have and what you choose to do with it." "You learned that from a banking manual," he said. "I learned it from this land," she said. "The banking manual was just the vocabulary." He looked at her across the table in the March evening, and the years of it were between them, the full, specific, known weight of each other, and the love that had grown from the careful, deliberate beginning to something vast and rooted and present in every moment of every day. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me," she said. "When I rode into Prescott that October morning and saw a woman on her knees on the boardwalk picking up scattered coins," he said, "I thought, that woman has more dignity than anyone I have ever seen. And then I thought I would very much like to know her. And then I spent a week trying to think of a legitimate reason to see her again and eventually resorted to a 3-cent piece." "I know," she said. "I knew at the time." "You let me keep the fiction," he said. "It was a kind fiction," she said. "And it was the beginning of something good. I was not going to argue with the beginning of something good." He reached across the table and took her hand. "Thank you for not going to Flagstaff." "I made the right decision," she said. "As I generally do, with sufficient time and information." He smiled. "You generally do." Outside, the March night was clear and cold and full of stars, and somewhere in the back of the house Robert was sleeping with the profligate ease of a small child in a safe place, and the ranch was quiet around them with the working quiet of a place that rests because the work is good and the people doing it are suited to it. By the summer of 1887, 5 years after Sallie had stood in the yard of her claim and buried her last hen and decided the territory had won, the Bancroft Ranch was a different kind of place than it had been, partly because of a good run of years and sound decisions and Pete Drummond's reliable management, and partly because of what Sallie had done with the books and the forward projections and the careful, steady business of keeping the whole operation in clear sight of itself. Clarence had added the east pasture fence as the projection had suggested. He had added the second breeding bull, and the herd had expanded accordingly. He had also, at Sallie's quiet recommendation, invested in a small share of the Prescott Water Company, a decision that the county's other ranchers had looked at skeptically for 2 years before beginning to recognize its soundness. Hector Vega, now 25, was the full foreman, and Pete Drummond had moved into a semi-retirement that consisted largely of doing whatever he felt like doing on a given day, which usually meant the same amount of work as before but on his own schedule and without anyone's authority over the matter. He had a small room at the ranch that was entirely his, and he ate his meals with the family as a matter of course, and Robert adored him with the uncomplicated ferocity of a small boy for a large, gentle man who had infinite patience and the best stories. Adelaide came to stay every summer for 3 weeks. She had sold the laundry business and opened a small lending library in Flagstaff, which was working beautifully, and she and Sallie spent those 3 summer weeks in a sustained and pleasurable conversation that ranged across every subject either of them had been thinking about since the previous summer. That summer Adelaide was there in July when Sallie told Clarence she was expecting again. He was sitting on the porch at dusk, having come in from a long day, and she sat beside him and told him, and he turned and looked at her with the same expression he had worn the first time, full and serious and overwhelmingly present. "Are you well?" he said, same as before. "I am perfectly well," she said, same as before. He reached over and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and the valley was golden and enormous in the evening light, and somewhere inside Adelaide was reading one of the borrowed books with the methodical pleasure of a woman in her element. Their daughter was born that winter, in February, and they named her Clara, and before Clarence could say anything about it, Sallie had said, "I have read that giving a daughter the name of a woman who left suggests confidence that this one will stay." She had made this up entirely. Clarence had looked at her for a moment and then had laughed, the deep, warm laugh she had collected like currency over 5 years, and had agreed to Clara without another word. Clara Bancroft was a different creature than her brother in every particular. Where Robert had been loud and opinionated, Clara was watchful and precise. She took in everything with enormous dark eyes and appeared to make detailed assessments that she kept largely to herself. She was fascinated by the books on Sallie's shelf from an early age and would sit with a volume in her lap, very seriously turning the pages she could not yet read, in a way that made Sallie feel understood by a person who was not yet 3 years old. Robert, for his part, was horse-mad from the moment he could sit upright, and Hector was his greatest hero for reasons that had nothing to do with foreman duties, and everything to do with the fact that Hector could make any horse in the corral do exactly what was needed within 20 minutes of working with it. By the time Robert was 6, he was on horseback with confidence, supervised and careful, and the way he sat in the saddle was already recognizably his father's posture. In the fall of 1889, a drought year, dry and demanding on the land, Sallie received a letter from the County Agricultural Board asking whether she would be willing to present, at the quarterly meeting in Prescott, a summary of bookkeeping practices and financial management strategies useful for small ranch operations. A county official named Mr. Garrett, who had encountered the Bancroft operations accounts through a water rights negotiation, had recommended her specifically. She read the letter twice. Then she read it to Clarence over breakfast. He put down his coffee cup. "They are asking you to teach," he said. "They are asking me to present," she said. "You will be wonderful at it," he said without a moment's hesitation. "I have not said I will do it," she said. "You are going to do it," he said. She looked at him. "You are very confident." "You taught a reading school at 21, he said. "You reorganized a decade of disastrous ranch accounts in 3 months. You have been telling me how to see our own finances clearly for 7 years. You know how to teach. You also know everything these ranchers need to know. It would be unreasonable not to do it." She folded the letter. "The meeting is in November," she said. "I will come with you," he said, "and the children can stay with Pete and Mrs. Ruiz." "You do not need to come," she said. "I know I do not need to," he said. "I want to." She wrote to the county board accepting the invitation. In November, she stood at the front of the Prescott Town Hall before 47 ranchers and their wives and 2 county officials, and she presented, in her clear, direct voice, a systematic approach to ranch financial management that drew on the methodology she had developed for the Bancroft operation and the banking manual principles she had taught herself years before. She spoke for an hour. She answered questions for another 40 minutes. She was neither nervous nor performing. She was simply herself, which had always been the most effective approach she had found. Afterward, a woman from the Skull Valley area named Mrs. Hernandez asked if Sallie would be willing to look at her operations books, and a man named Taggart from the east side of the county asked the same. And by the time she and Clarence walked back to the hotel for supper, she had 4 pending engagements. He held the door for her and she walked through and turned to look at him. "You were exceptional," he said. "I was competent and clear," she said, "which is what the situation required." "Sallie," he said gently, "you were exceptional. Please let me say so." She paused. "All right," she said. "Thank you." He smiled and offered her his arm, and she took it, and they went in to supper. The bookkeeping work she took on in the years that followed was careful and selective. She was the wife of a working rancher with 2 children and a household to manage, and she kept the Bancroft books as her primary professional responsibility. But she added 3 or 4 operations a year to her consulting work, always on her own terms, and she was paid fairly and asked for it if she was not offered it. And the work was good and satisfying in the way that work is satisfying when you are genuinely competent at it and genuinely needed. She also, in the spring of 1890, started a small lending library at the ranch, not a public one but an informal one, where she made the box of books and subsequent acquisitions available to any family in the area who wanted to borrow. It was a small thing. It was hers. The morning of their 10th anniversary, in May of 1892, Sallie woke before dawn, which she usually did, and dressed quietly and went out to the porch to make coffee. The valley was still dark and the stars were thick overhead, and the air had the particular quality of early spring mornings, cold and sweet and full of the nights held quiet. She was sitting with her cup when she heard the door behind her, and Clarence came out in his coat and sat beside her in his usual chair. He had a small package in his hand. 10 years, he said. 10 years, she agreed. He handed her the package. Inside, wrapped in brown paper, was a book she had been wanting for 2 years, a new natural history of the Arizona Territory plants and birds, complete with illustrations, that she had seen in the stationer's window in Prescott and mentioned, and then refused to purchase because the price was considerable. "You remembered," she said. "I remember everything you say," he said, as though this were obvious. She turned the book in her hands, looking at the illustrated cover, a careful drawing of the saguaro cactus with the mountains behind. She thought of the first book, Middlemark, in its newspaper wrapping, and the 11 books in the crate on the porch in November, and the shelf they had filled together over the years, which was now 2 shelves and would probably soon be 3. She reached into the pocket of her dress and produced an envelope. "I made this for you," she said. He opened it. Inside was a single page, written in her best hand, the pen she still used daily. It was a kind of accounting, not financial but the other kind, a record of the years. The cattle numbers and the pasture improvements, the hard winter and the good one, the births of Robert and Clara, the water rights agreements, the books added to the shelf, the words spoken on a rock by a spring in March, the ring at the front of a small stone church in May. Each thing given its proper place in the ledger of a life they had built together. At the bottom she had written, balance, incalculable, position, sound. He read it slowly all the way to the bottom. When he looked up, his eyes were bright in the pre-dawn dark, and he did not try to manage it. "Sallie," he said. "I know," she said. He reached over and she took his hand, and they sat in the early morning with the stars overhead, and the valley coming slowly out of the dark the way it did every morning, the way it had been doing every morning since long before they had found each other and would go on doing long after. The mountains and the creek and the green hills and the enormous, improbable, beautiful sky. Robert appeared at the door 10 minutes later, 8 years old and immediately awake in the way of children, wanting to know if there were flapjacks for the anniversary morning. Clara appeared behind him, 5 years old, and evaluating the situation with her characteristic precision. "There will be flapjacks," Sallie said. "If someone sets the table." Robert retreated inside immediately. Clara studied her parents for a moment with those large, assessing eyes, and then came and leaned against her mother's arm, and Sallie put her arm around the warm, small weight of her daughter and looked at her husband. He was looking back at her, in the way he always looked at her, directly and with all of it visible, no management and no performance, simply the truth of what he felt, which was the most generous thing he had ever given her, and he gave it every day. "Good morning," she said to him, as she had said every morning for 10 years. "Good morning," he said to her, as he had said it every morning for 10 years. The sky was going pale in the east. The first birds were starting. General, the mule, old and venerable, lifted his gray head in the near pasture and looked at the dawn with the equanimity of an animal who has seen considerable dawns and found them all acceptable. Pete Drummond came out of his room at the side of the house and stood in the yard and looked at the morning the way he always did, and then looked at the porch where Clarence and Sallie sat with Clara between them, and he allowed himself a small, private expression of satisfaction that he would have vigorously denied if anyone mentioned it. Hector arrived for the morning work an hour later, now settled into the foreman's role with the confidence of a man who knows his land and his job and his people. And the day began as all the days began, with the ordinary, beloved industry of a working place inhabited by people who had chosen it. In the afternoon, when the work was done and the children were occupied, and the November accounting Sallie had been preparing for the largest of her outside clients was set aside for the day, she and Clarence walked along the creek pasture the way they had walked it the first time, on that March afternoon in the year before their wedding, when the spring was running and the yellow flowers were coming up. The spring was still running. The valley was different in May than March, fuller and greener, humming with insects, the creek broad and clear, the flowers replaced by summer grasses that moved in the afternoon wind. Everything changed. Everything stayed. He took her hand when they reached the rock shelf above the spring, and they stood there and looked out at the ranch, at the roofline of the house visible above the trees, at the south pasture fence that ran straight and sound along the hillside, at the far blue mountains at the edge of the world. 10 years ago she had stood in a yard and buried a hen and decided the territory had won. She had driven 14 miles to Prescott to make arrangements. She had dropped her parcel on a boardwalk, and a man had crouched to help her gather what was scattered, and then he had stood and removed his hat and looked at her as though she was worth seeing, slowly and deliberately, and with everything he meant entirely in the gesture. The territory had not become easy. It had not become gentle. It was still demanding and hard and capable of drought and loss and seasons that ground you down, and that was simply the truth of it and always would be. But it was hers. She had fought for it and lost it and come back to it and made something of it, and she was standing in it now beside the man she loved with her children in the house behind them and the spring running at her feet, and the balance of it, as she had written on the page for their anniversary, was incalculable. She leaned against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The mountains stood blue and enormous in the May afternoon, the same mountains that had watched everything, the hard years and the good ones, the loss and the recovery, the beginning and the middle and all the further days that stretched out ahead, uncounted, unknowable, and full of the particular hope of people who have come through difficulty together, and emerged on the other side of it with everything that matters still intact. The wind moved through the grasses, and the creek ran clear and cold, and the ranch spread out below them under the great open sky, and Sallie Hawthorne Bancroft looked at it all and found that she was, entirely and without qualification, home.